A week before the war games of 1 to 4 May, the need of a thoroughgoing fleet reorganization designed to place paramount emphasis on carrier air power rather than surface gun power had been strongly urged by Commander Genda and other officers of the Nagumo force at a conference held on board Yamato to review the first phase operations. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi had specifically proposed that the entire mobile surface strength of Combined Fleet be reorganized into 3 task fleets, each of which would have a nucleus of 3 or 4 carriers with adequate numbers of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers to screen them. Combined Fleet already had plenty of screening ships and, by the latter part of 1942, was also expected to have enough carriers to form 3 such task fleets. 2 of them could be organized immediately, each well-balanced and with powerful carrier strength. Combined Fleet agreed to this proposal in principle, but actually, no action was taken to put it into effect prior to the Midway operation. The war games and study conferences thus ended with many officers in the operational forces dissatisfied over various aspects of the Midway plan, and with numerous important problems left unsolved. Some officers privately whispered that Combined Fleet Headquarters seemed seriously to underestimate enemy capabilities. None dared voice this accusation openly during the conferences, however, and to a considerable extent, the operational commands themselves were guilty of overconfidence. This was certainly true of the Nagumo force. We were so sure of our own strength that we thought we could smash the enemy fleet single-handed, even if the battleship groups did nothing to support us. At the conclusion of the study conferences, Admiral Yamamoto called upon all combined fleet forces to devote their fullest energies to the successful prosecution of the forthcoming operations. He said in part, "As a result of the smooth progress of the first phase operations, we have established an invincible strategic position. This position, however, cannot be maintained if we go on the defensive. In order to secure it tenaciously, we must keep on striking offensively at the enemy's weak points one after another. This will be the central aim of our second phase operations." Battle of the Coral Sea. Even while the Midway operation was being studied and rehearsed, developments which were to influence it profoundly were taking place nearly 3,000 miles away on the northeastern approaches to Australia. There, Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inuye's Fourth Fleet had launched the long-planned invasion moves toward Tulagi in the Solomons and Port Moresby in southeastern New Guinea, which on 7th May precipitated the Battle of the Coral Sea. As originally planned in January, the Tulagi and Port Moresby invasions were to have been carried out shortly after the occupation of Lae and Salamaua in early March. However, the appearance in the southeast area of an American naval force, estimated to consist of 2 fleet carriers, 4 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, and more than a dozen destroyers had led Combined Fleet to defer the operation until Fourth Fleet could be reinforced with a carrier division from the Nagumo force and some additional heavy cruisers. These reinforcements, consisting mainly of Carrier Division 5, Zuikaku, Shokaku, and Cruiser Division 5, Miyoko, Haguro, finally reached Fourth Fleet's home base at Truk just before the end of April. In addition, Combined Fleet released the light carrier Shoho to Fourth Fleet Command for the operations. Since both Carrier Division 5 and Cruiser Division 5 were scheduled to take part in the later Midway operation, Vice Admiral Inuye lost no time in getting started. His operational plan called for the seizure of Tulagi on 3rd of May, with the main assault on Port Moresby to be carried out a week later. The invasion convoys, staging out of Rabaul, were to be covered by 2 principal surface forces. One, a close covering group composed of light carrier Shoho, 4 heavy cruisers, and a destroyer, commanded by Rear Admiral Aritomo Goto. The other, a carrier striking force made up of Zuikaku and Shokaku, the 2 heavy cruisers of Cruiser Division 5, and 6 destroyers, commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi. Under Takagi, carrier air operations were to be commanded by Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara, Commander Carrier Division 5. The two forces sortied from Truk on 30 April and 1 May, respectively. The Tulagi landing was successfully carried out on 3 May according to plan, and the next day, the Port Moresby invasion force embarked from Rabaul in 14 transports, escorted by 1 light cruiser and 6 destroyers. It had barely gotten underway, however, when enemy carrier aircraft delivered a severe attack on the Tulagi beachhead, sinking or damaging a number of small Japanese naval craft offshore. This gave warning of the presence of an enemy task force in the vicinity, and Vice Admiral Takagi's carrier striking force, which was still some distance north of the Solomons, promptly headed south at high speed to locate and engage the enemy. The Port Moresby convoy, not yet in danger, continued on its way, closely covered by Rear Admiral Goto's force. By the morning of 6th May, the Takagi force had skirted around the southeastern extremity of the Solomons and entered the Coral Sea. But it was not until the next day that it finally made contact with the enemy. At dawn on the 7th, search planes were launched from the carriers, and shortly thereafter one of them radioed back that it had sighted an enemy task force, including 1 carrier, about 160 miles south of the Japanese position. The entire attack strength of Zuikaku and Shokaku, a total of 78 bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters, immediately took off to attack, but when they reached the reported enemy position, they found that the task force actually was only a large oiler escorted by a single destroyer. The 2 ships, later identified as Neosho and Sims, were subjected to a fierce attack, which sank the destroyer and left the oiler heavily damaged and afire, with its crew abandoning ship. Battle of the Coral Sea, 5 to 7 May 1942. Only a short while after the attack groups had taken off and headed for their objective, Rear Admiral Hara, commanding the air operations, received reports from search planes of the Goto force, strongly indicating that the earlier sighting report had been erroneous and placing the enemy carrier group to the southeast of the Louisiade archipelago. It was too late, however, to divert the attack, and a precious opportunity to strike the first blow at the enemy carriers was lost. The failure proved costly for the Japanese forces, for while the Zuikaku and Shokaku air units were busy attacking Neosho and Sims, planes from the enemy carriers discovered a much more worthwhile target. Vice Admiral Inui, commanding the overall Japanese operations from Rabaul, had already ordered the Port Moresby Transport Group to retire northward until the threat from the enemy carriers was eliminated. It was executing this order, covered by Rear Admiral Goto's force when, at 1100 on the 7th, a force of nearly 100 American bombers and torpedo planes spotted the covering group and delivered a fierce attack. The enemy aircraft concentrated almost entirely on light carrier Shoho, which was heavily hit and went to the bottom at 11:35. By the time the attack groups of Zuikaku and Shokaku were ready to take off again, it was late afternoon, and Rear Admiral Hara felt that it would be too risky to send his full strength against the enemy carriers, as the pilots would have to find their way back and land in darkness. Still, he was eager to strike as quickly as possible, and therefore decided to launch part of his strength for a dusk attack, using only picked crews trained in night operations. At 16:30, a force of 27 bombers and torpedo planes took off and headed for the enemy's estimated position. It failed, however, to spot the carriers, and instead had the misfortune to run into an enemy fighter patrol, losing several planes in the ensuing dogfight. The remaining planes turned back and on their way passed right over the enemy carriers without being able to attack because they had already jettisoned their bombs and torpedoes. Before dawn the next day, 8 May, the Takagi force again sent out float planes to look for the enemy, and at 0824, they radioed back that they had spotted the American carrier group bearing 205 degrees, 235 miles from the Japanese force. The group was reported to include 2 carriers and 1 other large unit, probably a battleship. Zuikaku and Shokaku immediately launched their full attack strength, aggregating about 70 bombers and torpedo planes. At 11:20, the attack groups arrived over the target and began their assault against strong anti-aircraft fire and fighter opposition. The attack was highly effective, though not the total success that the reports of the returning flyers led Admirals Takagi and Hara to believe. According to these reports, both enemy carriers, one mistakenly identified as Saratoga, actually Lexington, and the other correctly as Yorktown, had been sent to the bottom, and a battleship or cruiser had been damaged. The actual results, not known to the Japanese until much later, were that Lexington, though not sunk in the attack, was so heavily damaged that she had to be abandoned and finished off by torpedoes from her destroyer escort. Later the same day, while Yorktown sustained a single bomb hit, which, though it caused considerable damage, did not put her out of action. In the meantime, the Takagi force also underwent attack by the air groups of the American carriers. The enemy planes, which were on their way at the same time that Japanese planes headed for Lexington and Yorktown, appeared over the Takagi force at 10:50 and continued attacking until 12:20. Zuikaku managed to elude the attack by heading into a rain squall, which hid her from the enemy pilots. But Shokaku, absorbing the full fury of the assault, sustained 3 direct bomb hits, which rendered her incapable of continuing flight operations. Consequently, Shokaku was ordered to withdraw, and Zuikaku had to recover the planes of both carriers. The tide of battle now appeared to have veered strongly in favor of the Japanese, for despite the loss of Shoho and damage to Shokaku, Zuikaku remained unharmed, whereas both of the American carriers were believed to have been eliminated. This seemed to present an excellent opportunity for the Takagi force to continue the offensive and complete the enemy's destruction. At about 1700 on the 8th, however, Vice Admiral Inouye at Rabaul suddenly ordered the striking force to break off the action and retire, following this up a short while later, with a further order postponing the Port Moresby invasion and directing the transport group to put back to Rabaul. The reason for the 4th Fleet Commander's decision apparently was his estimate that, although the American carrier group had been crushed, the carrier air strength remaining on the Japanese side was insufficient to protect the invasion force against land-based air assault. When reports of Admiral Inouye's action reached Combined Fleet headquarters late on the 8th, Admiral Yamamoto, highly displeased at Inouye's failure to exploit the advantage gained in the carrier battle of that morning, dispatched a strongly worded order to the 4th Fleet Commander, directing that every effort be made to complete the destruction of the enemy force. Takagi was consequently ordered to head south again and re-establish contact, but 2 days of searching for the enemy proved fruitless, and his force finally retired from the battle area on the night of 10 May. A tally of Japanese losses in the Battle of the Coral Sea showed Wright carrier Shoho, destroyer Kikuzuki, and 3 small naval units sunk, carrier Shokaku damaged, some 77 planes lost, and a total of 1,074 men killed or wounded. On the other hand, actual losses inflicted on the enemy, as learned after the war, were carrier Lexington, oiler Neosho, and destroyer Sims sunk, carrier Yorktown damaged, 66 planes lost, and 543 killed or wounded. Thus, if the Coral Sea battle can be said to have been a Japanese victory, it was a victory only by the narrowest numerical margin, even without taking into account the thwarting of the Port Moresby invasion. Certainly, the actual outcome was a far cry from the sweeping triumph which was announced to the Japanese nation over the radio, to the stirring accompaniment of the Navy March. Rather than upset the time schedule already fixed for later operations, Combined Fleet now decided on an indefinite postponement of the move against Port Moresby and ordered Carrier Division 5 and Cruiser Division 5 to return to the homeland immediately to prepare for the Midway invasion. On 17th May, Shokaku reached Kure, having the unenvied distinction of being the most heavily damaged Japanese warship to put in at that naval base since the beginning of hostilities. The fact that hits by only 3 medium bombs had rendered her incapable of flight operations was a striking lesson in carrier vulnerability. Furthermore, a survey of her damages showed that at least 1 month would be required to complete repairs, which meant that she could not participate in the Midway operation. Carrier Division 5 flagship Zuikaku, which followed Shokaku into port a few days later, had escaped physical damage, but because of heavy losses of flying personnel, it was soon apparent that she also would not be available for the Midway operation. Even if aircraft and aircrew replacements were promptly provided, only a week now remained before the sortie of the Nagumo force, and it would clearly be impossible to give the replacement personnel enough shipboard training to enable the carrier to function effectively in battle. Thus, the Coral Sea victory had far-reaching consequences for the Midway operation. The elimination of Zuikaku and Shokaku deprived the Nagumo force of 1/3 of its airstriking power, possibly the margin that made the difference between victory and defeat. The unexpected exclusion of Carrier Division 5 from the Midway forces, however, did not diminish the optimism with which Combined Fleet Headquarters, or the Nagumo force for that matter, viewed the impending operation. As the 2 American carriers involved in the Coral Sea battle were both believed to have been sunk, the ratio of carrier strength available for the Midway contest still appeared to be overwhelmingly in Japan's favor. The Nagumo force, with the battle-tested carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu still at its disposal, was fully confident of its ability to crush any enemy force that might be thrown against it. Even the Naval General Staff, which originally had opposed the Midway venture as too risky, now seemed to have little apprehension regarding the outcome. These calculations were, of course, proven wrong by later events. Yorktown had not been sunk in the Coral Sea, nor was she even damaged badly enough to keep her from participating in the next battle. The full story, as it became known to the Japanese after the war, showed that Yorktown hastened back to Pearl Harbor, where repair crews, by working around the clock for 2 straight days, succeeded in making her ready for sea in time to join the forces sent to forestall the Midway invasion. This achievement was in striking contrast to our own lackadaisical effort, as a result of which neither Shokaku nor Zuikaku was able to participate in the Midway operation. Final preparations. After the conclusion of the war games and staff conferences on board Yamato during the first week of May, the flagship weighed anchor and proceeded from Hashirajima to Kure in order to load supplies and effect minor repairs. The harbor of the naval base seethed with tremendous activity. Ships kept arriving and departing in a never-ending procession, and small craft plied incessantly between the shore and warships moored in the harbor, shuttling supplies. Although the beginning of summer was almost at hand, Ryujo and Junyo, the 2 carriers assigned to Vice Admiral Hosogaya's northern force, were conspicuously loading quantities of heavy winter clothing and equipment. It was easy for their crews, as well as personnel of the base, to guess that a part of the forces would be operating in Arctic waters. On 18th May, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, commander of the Army detachment, which was to participate in the Midway landing, went on board Yamato with his staff to confer with Admiral Yamamoto and to be briefed on the operational plan. This virtually completed the briefing of all the participating forces, and on the 19th, Yamato returned to Hashirajima to make final sortie preparations. The next day, Admiral Yamamoto issued an order, which finally fixed the tactical grouping of the fleet forces as already outlined in the preceding chapter. The order also contained an estimate of enemy strength in the Midway, Hawaii, and Aleutians areas as follows. Midway area, about 24 patrol flying boats, 12 Army bombers, and 20 fighters. Several patrol boats stationed around Midway, and a number of submarines evidently operating to the west of the island. Hawaii area, About 60 patrol flying boats, 100 Army bombers, and 200 fighters. Naval combat strength: 2 or 3 carriers, 2 or 3 escort carriers, 4 or 5 heavy cruisers, 3 or 4 light cruisers, about 30 destroyers, and 25 submarines. Aleutians area. No enemy naval and air strength or important installations except at Dutch Harbor. Supplementing the above estimate, it was judged on the basis of Japanese intelligence that Midway was defended by a force of about 750 Marines, abundantly equipped with coastal defense guns and anti-aircraft artillery. The air strength based on the island, it was estimated, could rapidly be reinforced from Hawaii and might possibly be doubled as soon as the Japanese intention to attack became known. Intelligence indicated that the enemy's flying boats were conducting regular day and night patrols over a semicircular arc westward of Midway to a distance of 600 miles. The combined fleet estimate of enemy carrier strength in the Hawaiian Islands was based principally on the calculation that Hornet and Enterprise, which were known to have been involved in the Tokyo raid of 18th April, were now back at Pearl Harbor. A possible third carrier was added to allow for the eventuality that one of the 2 carriers believed sunk in the Battle of the Coral Sea might have been only damaged and have succeeded in making it back to Hawaii, or that Wasp, whose whereabouts was not known, might be in the Hawaiian area. Ranger was definitely believed to be operating in the Atlantic. Lexington, actually Saratoga, was believed to have been sunk by a Japanese submarine near Hawaii in January 1942, but there were subsequent reports that she had gotten back to the United States West Coast and was undergoing repairs. That was all the enemy's carrier strength, except for newly built escort carriers, a few of which were considered likely to be at Hawaii. These, however, because of their inferior speed, were not regarded as augmenting the enemy's effective strength for fleet combat. Despite the 20 May estimate, there were some indications that the enemy might be caught with even fewer than the 2 or 3 carriers which combined fleet anticipated might be available in the Hawaiian area to oppose the Japanese invasion of Midway. On 18th May, a patrol plane of the South Seas Force had spotted an enemy task force with 2 carriers to the east of the Solomons, which suggested that Hornet and Enterprise had again sortied from Pearl Harbor to operate in the Southwest Pacific. This seemed to be confirmed by subsequent radio intelligence, indicating the presence of an enemy carrier force to the south of the Solomons, and also by a reported raid on Tulagi by enemy carrier planes a short while later. Should this enemy force continue operating in the Solomons area, it appeared likely that the Americans would have virtually no carrier strength available at Hawaii to throw against the Midway invasion force. The invasion would then be easy, but the hope of luring the enemy fleet into decisive battle would be gone. May 20th also saw the departure from Yokosuka and Kure of the transport group, carrying the Army and Navy landing forces for Midway. The transports headed for the assembly point at Saipan, where they arrived on 24th May, Rear Admiral Takeo Kurita's support force of heavy cruisers, simultaneously arriving at nearby Guam in preparation for covering the advance of the invasion convoy on Midway. Various units of Vice Admiral Hosogaya's northern force likewise began moving out of the western inland sea after the 20th, heading for Ominato, the staging point for the Aleutians' invasion. Slowly, the massive battle forces were getting into motion. Forces which were to proceed direct from the inland sea to the battle area still had a week to wait. Admiral Yamamoto decided not to let this time go to waste, and on 21st May, the main force, the Kondo Force, and Vice Admiral Nagumo's first carrier striking force went out through Bungo Strait into the open sea and for 2 days engaged in fleet maneuvers, the biggest undertaken since before the outbreak of war, and the last ever to be staged in the open sea by the Imperial Navy. On 25th of May, back in Hashirajima anchorage, the Midway and Aleutians operations were once more rehearsed in tabletop maneuvers held on board Yamato. The assembled commanders and staff officers also listened to a detailed report of the Coral Sea battle given by Vice Admiral Takagi, who had commanded the Japanese force in that engagement. Now everything was ready for the big sortie. Force commanders and staff officers assembled at Hashirajima, gathered on board Yamato, and joined Admiral Yamamoto in toasting the success of the forthcoming operation with cups of sake bestowed by His Majesty the Emperor. 7. Heading for battle. Sortie of forces. The stage was now set for the launching of the Midway operation. At each of the 3 takeoff points, Ominato on northern Honshu, Hashirajima in the western inland sea, and Saipan and Guam in the Marianas, the forces were poised and ready to head for their objectives. Rear Admiral Kakuji, Kakuta's second carrier striking force, assigned to the Aleutians' prong of the offensive, was the first to sortie. Flying his flag in light carrier Ryujo, Kakuta took his force out of Ominato Harbor at noon on 26th of May, transited Tsugaru Strait, and set an easterly course across the northern Pacific. Late the same night, the force encountered a dense and seemingly endless fog, which made it difficult to keep formation, since not one of the ships was equipped with radar, and strict radio silence was in force. Even so, the fog was not entirely unwelcome, for it lessened the danger of discovery by enemy submarines known to be lurking in the waters east of Hokkaido. For this, the officers and men were grateful, but at the same time, they fervently hoped that the fog would be gone by 4th of June, when the carriers were to launch their strike against Dutch Harbor. The following morning, 27th of May, saw the departure of the Nagurno force from Hashirajima anchorage. As related in the opening chapter, the 21 ships of the force threaded their way through Bungo Strait at about noon, and by nightfall were well into the Pacific, forging southeastward in circular cruising disposition. There was no indication that we had been discovered by enemy submarines, and I turned in for the night with a comfortable feeling that all was going well. My own luck, however, was not to hold. I had barely dropped off to sleep when I was suddenly awakened by sharp abdominal pains. Commander Tamai, Akagi's chief surgeon, was quickly summoned, and after a careful examination, he announced that it was appendicitis and he would have to operate immediately. This was a hard blow, for it meant that I would be a helpless spectator of the exciting events about to begin. I asked Tamai if he couldn't possibly treat me so that I could keep going for another 10 days without an operation, but he was adamant. Commander Genda joined in, urging me to follow the surgeon's advice. The appendectomy was performed that night as Akagi sped on her way, and I awoke early the next afternoon in the ship's sickbay to find the sharp pain of the night before reduced to a dull ache, the aftermath of Tamai's surgery. A corpsman who came in to see how I was getting on told me that our noon position had been 430 miles south of Tokyo, and that we were now headed east. Meanwhile, the other forces were also sortieing according to plan. From Ominato, Vice Admiral Hosogaya's Northern Force main body and the Attu and Kiska invasion forces departed on the 28th. Far to the south, the transports carrying the Midway landing forces, escorted by Rear Admiral Tanaka's light cruiser flagship Jinsu and 12 destroyers, together with seaplane carrier Chitose, tender Kamikawa Maru, and other units, sortied from Saipan during that same evening. In order to deceive any enemy submarines that might be lurking in the vicinity, the invasion convoy first took a westerly course and skirted around to the south of Tinian before heading eastward. Rear, Admiral Kurita's support group of heavy cruisers sortied almost simultaneously from Guam and took a parallel course about 40 miles to the southwest of the invasion convoy. Last to sortie were the main body of the Midway invasion force under Vice Admiral Kondo and the main force under direct command of Admiral Yamamoto. Kondo's ships began moving out of Hashirajima during the early morning of 29th of May, light cruiser Yura, and 7 destroyers of Destroyer Squadron 4 leading the way, followed by Cruiser Divisions 4, Atago, Chokai, and 5, Miyoko, Haguro, Battleship Division 3. Lesset's second section, Hiei, Congo, light carrier Zuiho, and 1 destroyer. Admiral Kondo flew his flag in heavy cruiser Atago. After passing through Bungo Strait, the force headed eastward. Admiral Yamamoto's main force of 32 ships sortied on the heels of the Kondo force. Light cruiser Sendai and 20 destroyers under Commander Destroyer Squadron 3, Rear Admiral Shintaro Hashimoto, were in the van, followed by Cruiser Division 9, light cruisers Kitakami and Oi, under Rear Admiral Fukuji Kishi, Battleship Division 1, Yamato, Nagato, Mutsu, directly under Admiral Yamamoto, and Battleship Division 2, Ise, Hyuga, Fuzo, Yamashiro, under Vice Admiral Takasu. Light carrier Hosho and 1 destroyer brought up the rear. It was 5 months since the battleship group had last sortied from home waters. Throughout the first phase operations in the southern area, it had remained in the inland sea training rigorously for what it hoped would be a major role in the anticipated decisive battle against the American fleet. The officers and men of the big battle wagons were still confident that their massive firepower would win the battle when it came. Now, at last, it looked as if they were going to have their chance to prove it, and the morale of the crews was high. The strength of the force was greater than ever by reason of the addition of Yamato, armed with the heaviest guns afloat, now making her maiden sortie. As the main force headed for Bungo Strait, destroyers patrolling outside the strait suddenly reported sighting 2 enemy submarines. Radio intelligence had also reported a total of 6 enemy submarines operating in waters close to the homeland and 4 more operating to the northeast of Wake Island. Anti-submarine operations by surface units and planes from Kure Naval Base were immediately intensified, and all ships of the Kondo and Yamamoto forces were ordered to proceed under strict anti-submarine alert. Both forces passed through the danger area happily without mishap. After reaching the open sea, the main force shifted its cruising disposition, the battleships forming 2 parallel columns, with Yamato, Nagato, and Mutsu on the right, and Ise, Hyuga, Fuso, and Yamashiro on the left. Between the 2 columns, light carrier Hosho took position and engaged in launching and recovering anti-submarine patrol planes. Light cruiser Sendai and 20 destroyers formed a circular screen around the battleship group at a distance of 1,500 meters. Light cruisers Kitakami and Oi were stationed on the rear flanks, 10,000 meters apart, to guard against tracking enemy submarines. The force proceeded southeast at a speed of 18 knots, zigzagging at intervals of 5 to 10 minutes. Admiral Nagumo. As I lay in Akagi's sickbay, convalescing from the operation I had undergone on the night of our sortie, my thoughts naturally centered on the momentous operation in which our fleet was engaged. I thought especially of the heavy burden of responsibility resting on the shoulders of our own commander, Admiral Nagumo, whose force was spearheading the attack. Would he measure up to this responsibility? My first acquaintance with Admiral Nagumo dated back to 1933. I was then a lieutenant and chief flying officer of heavy cruiser Maya, assigned to Cruiser Division 4, 2nd Fleet. Besides Maya, the division comprised flagship Chokai, Takao, and Atago, Japan's newest heavy cruisers. Nagumo, then a captain, was commanding officer of Takao. My duties brought me into frequent contact with Captain Nagumo, a capable, intelligent, and energetic officer who was rated high among the many able captains in the fleet. He belonged to what Navy officers called the Red Brick Group. This meant that he had already served a tour of duty in the Navy Ministry, the curious designation coming from the fact that the Navy Ministry building was made of red brick. He had also served in the Naval General Staff, on the staff of Combined Fleet, and as an instructor at the Naval War College. His command of a heavy cruiser followed the normal course of promotion to flag rank. He would get a battleship the following year, and eventually would become a fleet commander. In the combined fleet tactical organization prevailing at that time, the Second Fleet constituted the advance force. Consequently, the emphasis in our training was primarily on torpedo attacks and night engagements. Captain Nagumo, an expert in torpedo warfare, was the right man in the right place. As a junior officer whose job was simply to fly planes, I looked up to him with a feeling of awe and admiration because of the outstanding way he discharged his exacting duties. Every aspect of his leadership impressed me. His speeches at maneuver conferences were always logical and enlightening, and one could not help respecting his extraordinary ability. Candid, yet open-hearted and considerate, he was always willing to assist the younger officers. We held him in high esteem and placed complete confidence in him. At this time, sentiment in favor of abrogating the Washington Naval Limitation Treaty was rapidly mounting in the Navy. In our eyes, the attitude of the central authorities seemed weak-kneed, and Captain Nagumo was leading an active movement against it. He busily visited the commanding officers of other ships and urged them to join in, pressing for early abrogation of the treaty. As a result of his efforts, a recommendation was drafted and, after being signed by many officers, was forwarded to the central authorities through fleet headquarters as representing the opinion of the fleet. This particularly pleased the young officers who always favored a firm policy, whatever it might be. My impressions of Captain Nagumo at that time convinced me that he would be a great naval leader. Our paths did not cross again until 1941, by which time Nagumo had risen to Vice Admiral in command of 1st Air Fleet. I was assigned as a wing leader on carrier Akagi. In the intervening years, Nagumo's reputation had continued to rise, especially during his command of Destroyer Squadron 1 as a rear admiral. Serving under him again revived my memories of 7 years earlier, and I was happy to be a member of his command. It was not long, however, before I noted that Nagumo had changed, and I began to feel dissatisfied with his apparent conservatism and passiveness. It might have been because he was now commanding an air arm, which was not his specialty. Personally, he was as warm-hearted and sympathetic as ever, but his once vigorous fighting spirit seemed to be gone, and with it his stature as an outstanding naval leader. Instead, he seemed rather average, and I was suddenly aware of his increased age. In directing operations, he no longer seemed to take the initiative, and when plans were being developed, he most often merely approved the recommendations of his staff. Commander Genda, his operations officer, once summed up the situation to me in these words: "Whenever I draft a plan, it is approved almost without consideration. This might appear to make my job easier, but it doesn't. On the contrary, it is disquieting to see my own plans approved without any check from above, and then issued as formal orders. I am self-confident, but not so self-confident that I don't realize that anyone can make mistakes. Often I am puzzled over how to resolve an important problem. When I consider that a stroke of my pen might sway the destiny of the nation, it almost paralyzes me with fear. If I were serving under a commander like Admiral Onishi or Admiral Yamaguchi, my plans would be thoroughly studied from every possible angle and returned to me with comments and opinions. I would then feel more sure and more free to propose ideas that might be extreme. I understood exactly what Genda meant and was in complete sympathy with him. Unfortunately, such passiveness was not peculiar to Nagumo alone. It was a common failing in the Japanese Navy. Fleet commanders generally were inclined to leave all details to their staffs and content themselves with controlling only the broad outline of affairs. Thus, the personality of the commander was rarely reflected in the execution of operations. This tendency to rely excessively on the staff was promoted by the fact that, under the Japanese Navy system, Officers whose seniority put them in line for a fleet command were often given one for which their special qualifications did not suit them. The appointment of Nagumo, whose specialty was torpedo warfare, to command the 1st Air Fleet was an example. A commander's shortcomings in special fields were supposed to be compensated for by the specialists on his staff. The result was that the influence of the staff officers naturally became very great. This did not mean, however, that staff officers trespassed on the authority of their superiors. Final responsibility for an operation always rested with the commander, and every action was presumed to have been taken by his decision. Indeed, Nagumo, passive though he was, did not always leave everything to his subordinates. There were occasions when he disregarded their advice and chose his own course of action. Developments 30 to 31 May. The end of 29 May found the various Japanese forces forging ahead toward their objectives without any hitch other than the fog still plaguing the Kakuta force. On the 30th, however, the weather also began to deteriorate over that part of the Central Pacific now being traversed by the Yamamoto and Kondo forces. In the afternoon, the Yamamoto force encountered rain and increasingly strong winds, which caused the destroyers and cruisers to ship occasional seas over their bows, making navigation difficult. The formation cut its speed to 14 knots, and zigzagging was discontinued. It was not only the weather that was ominous. Yamato's radio crew, which was keeping a close watch on enemy communications traffic, intercepted a long, urgent message sent by an enemy submarine from a position directly ahead of the Japanese transport group. The message was addressed to Midway. It was in code, and we could not decipher it, but it suggested the possibility that the transport group had been discovered. If so, it would be logical for the enemy to surmise that the transports were almost certainly heading for Midway to attempt an invasion, since so large a convoy sailing east-northeast from Saipan could hardly be taken as merely a supply force going to Wake Island. Admiral Yamamoto's staff officers, however, were not greatly concerned. They nonchalantly took the view that if the enemy had guessed our purpose and now sent his fleet out to oppose the invasion, the primary Japanese objective of drawing out the enemy forces to be destroyed in decisive battle would be achieved. Bad weather continued in the Central Pacific on 31st May. Not only the Yamamoto and Kondo forces, but also Vice Admiral Nagumo's carriers, which were a few hundred miles farther east, encountered strong winds and occasional rain. Meanwhile, Yamato's radio intelligence unit observed further signs of enemy activity, especially of aircraft and submarines, in both the Hawaii and Aleutians vicinities. Admiral Yamamoto and his staff surmised that the activity around Hawaii might presage a sortie by an enemy task force, and they waited eagerly for reports of the flying boat reconnaissance, which was to have been carried out over Hawaii on this date. The 2 Type 2 flying boats assigned to this mission, designated the 2nd Operation K, had duly moved up to Wache and were scheduled to take off at 2400 May 30th, Tokyo time, to reach French frigate Shoals by 14:30, 17:30 local time, shortly before sunset, refuel there from submarines, and take off within an hour and a half for Hawaii. If all went well, they would arrive over Hawaii at 2045, 01:15, May 31st, local time. After completing their reconnaissance, they would fly non-stop back to Wache, reaching there about 09:20, Tokyo time, on June. Vice Admiral Komatsu, Commander Submarine Force, had assigned 6 submarines to the operation. 3 of them were to refuel the flying boats at French frigate Shoals. Another was to take station on a line between Wache and French frigate Shoals, about 550 miles from the latter, to serve as a radio picket ship. The 5th was to lie off Keauhou Point, on the island of Hawaii, as a rescue boat in case of mishap, and the 6th was to be stationed 80 miles southwest of Oahu for patrol and weather observation. The carefully laid plan, however, had already gone awry. On 30th May, AMA 123, one of the fueling subs, reached French frigate Shoals, and, to its dismay, found 2 enemy ships lying at anchor. It urgently radioed this information back to Kwajalein, adding that there appeared to be little prospect of carrying out the refueling operation at the shoals as planned. Vice Admiral Goto, 24th Air Flotilla Commander at Kwajalein, who was responsible for directing the second Operation K, accordingly ordered a 24-hour postponement, instructing I-123 to keep watching the shoals in the hope that the enemy ships would depart. This forlorn hope was blasted the following day when I-123 reported that she had sighted 2 enemy flying boats near the entrance to the shoals. This made it apparent that the enemy was already using the shoals as a seaplane base, and there, consequently, was no alternative to complete abandonment of Operation K. These disappointing developments were promptly communicated to Admiral Yamamoto in Yamato. The failure of Operation K meant that there was no way of ascertaining what enemy strength actually was present at Pearl Harbor. Nevertheless, Combined Fleet Headquarters still hoped that, if an enemy force did sortie from that base to oppose the Midway invasion, the submarine cordon scheduled to be established by Vice Admiral Komatsu's command between Hawaii and Midway by 2nd June would suffice to provide advance warning as well as knowledge of the enemy's strength. 1 to 2 June. The 1st of June found the Yamamoto force still surrounded by dark, forbidding weather, although the rain had ceased. Low-lying clouds made visibility so poor that it was barely possible from Yamato's bridge to make out the phantom shapes of the destroyer screen 1,500 meters away. It was now time for the main force to rendezvous with its tanker train and refuel. The oilers were not found at the pre-arranged rendezvous point, however, and Hosho launched planes to look for them. The search proved unsuccessful because of poor visibility, but at this point, the tanker train radioed its position to Yamato, making it possible to effect a rendezvous. At the same time, because radio silence had been broken, it had to be assumed that the enemy was now aware of the position of the main force. Evidence that the enemy had already discovered, or at the very least, strongly suspected, the Japanese advance toward Midway mounted sharply during the day. Radio intelligence disclosed a marked intensification of communications traffic out of Hawaii, and 72 out of 180 intercepted messages were urgent, indicating an unusually tense situation. A chance encounter 500 miles north-northeast of Wocha between a Japanese patrol plane from that island and an American flying boat, which exchanged brief machine gun bursts, also showed that the enemy had extended his Midway-based air patrols out to a radius of 700 miles. There were still further reports to the effect that enemy submarines had been sighted about 500 miles northeast and north-northeast of Wake Island, which almost certainly indicated the existence of an American submarine patrol line some 600 miles southwest of Midway. By this time, the Midway transport convoy had reached a point about 1,000 miles to the west of Midway and was proceeding on a northeast course. Advancing at a rate of 240 miles in 24 hours, the convoy would enter the 700-mile patrol radius of American planes from Midway on 3rd June, 2 days before the date set for the pre-invasion airstrike on the island by the Nagumo force. It looked as if the transports were advancing too fast for their own safety. Cloudy weather, with occasional rain, persisted in the vicinity of the Yamamoto force on 2nd June. Fueling operations, which had started the preceding day after the delayed rendezvous with the tankers, were resumed in the morning, but had to be discontinued again when visibility became so poor that the ships could no longer maneuver safely. Still another hitch now developed in the operation plan. Owing to overhaul delays, which had postponed their departure from the homeland, the submarines of Squadron 5, assigned to the B Cordon Line, scheduled to be established on 2nd June to the northwest of Hawaii, failed to reach their assigned positions. Boats of Submarine Squadron 3, assigned to the A Cordon Line to the west of Hawaii, were also unable to reach their stations because of delays resulting from the miscarriage of Operation K. Actually, it was not until 4 June that the submarines arrived on station. With the submarine cordons not yet established, Admiral Yamamoto and his staff remained completely in the dark regarding enemy task force activities. During 2nd June, however, submarine I-168, reconnoitering the Midway area, sent in a few bits of information regarding the situation there. The report stated that no ships had been observed other than a picket ship south of Sand Island, that the enemy appeared to be flying intensive air patrols to the southwest, probably to a distance of 600 miles, that a strict alert seemed to be in force, with numerous aircraft on defensive patrol day and night, and that many construction cranes were visible on the island, suggesting that installations were being expanded. This turned out to be the only significant reconnaissance report sent in by a submarine during the Midway operation, despite the great reliance placed on them by Combined Fleet Headquarters. During the 2nd, the Nagumo Force, cruising some 600 miles ahead of the Yamamoto Force, entered an area enveloped in thick mist. Clouds hovered low over the ocean, and light rain began to fall. Fog seemed likely to follow. Already, visibility was so restricted that neighboring ships in the formation could scarcely see each other. Vice Admiral Nagumo in flagship Akagi was as much in the dark about enemy fleet movements and intentions as Combined Fleet Headquarters. Indeed, because of Akagi's limited radio receiving capacity, coupled with the radio silence being observed by the advancing Japanese forces, he lacked much of the information which had been received by Admiral Yamamoto in the fleet flagship, and which strongly suggested that the enemy was already aware or highly suspicious of a Japanese advance toward Midway, and was preparing to counter it. This was precisely the situation which Rear Admiral Kusaka, Nagumo Force Chief of Staff, had feared might develop. Prior to the sortie, he had repeatedly requested that Yamato relay all important radio intelligence information to Akagi, but it was apparent that Admiral Yamamoto and his staff still hoped that surprise had not been lost and felt it advisable to continue radio silence. Thus, as 2nd June ended, the Japanese forces were steadily approaching their objectives through adverse weather. Thus far, there was no certain indication that any of them had actually been detected by the enemy, and every man from Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet on down hoped that the precious advantage of surprise was still in Japanese hands. 3 June. By dawn. On 3rd June, the mist which the Nagumo force had encountered the previous afternoon had become a heavy blanket of fog. Steaming at fog navigation quarters, adjoining ships in the formation were often unable to see each other across their scant 600-yard intervals. Powerful searchlights were turned on, but they scarcely showed through the gloom. The task of maintaining zigzag courses through this endless veil, with only momentary and infrequent glimpses of consorting ships, was arduous and nerve-wracking. Yet it had to be done, for we were entering waters patrolled by enemy submarines. While the fog was advantageous in keeping us hidden from prying scout planes, this benefit was canceled by the increased hazards of navigation. Moreover, the fog would not hamper the enemy's radar-equipped submarines, yet it prevented us from launching anti-submarine patrol planes. To cope with these and other problems that beset us, all ships were at full alert and double watches were posted at submarine lookout stations. The starboard side of Akagi's bridge was occupied by Admiral Nagumo and his entire staff. They stared silently at the impenetrable curtain surrounding the ship, and each face was tense with anxiety. Captain Aoki and his navigation officer, Commander Miura, on the other side of the bridge, devoted their entire energies to keeping the ship on course and maintaining position in the formation. From time to time, they leaned out of the window in an effort to peer through the all-encompassing fog. A change in course was scheduled for 10:30, and it had to be executed if our timetable was to be carried out. Yet, prior to execution of such a course change in heavy fog, confirmation would have to be communicated to all ships in the formation, lest some stray and become lost. With visibility so limited, flag signals obviously could not be employed. and even searchlights would be ineffective to transmit the required orders. Nothing remained but to use radio, which was sure to reveal our presence and position to the enemy, a matter of deep concern to Admiral Nagumo and his staff. This distressing situation served to bring out the fact that Nagumo had been assigned 2 tactical missions, which were essentially incompatible. The assignment to attack Midway on 5 June, in preparation for the landing operation, put his force under rigid limitations of movement. The other mission, to contact and destroy enemy naval forces, required that Nagumo be entirely free to move as the situation required, and it also made it absolutely essential to keep our whereabouts secret while searching for the enemy. A decision obviously had to be made as to which of these missions should be given precedence. Nagumo's staff had pondered this problem hypothetically for a long time, but now the task force commander faced a situation requiring a definitive choice. And still, there was not a scrap of information about enemy naval forces. In this critical situation, the senior member of the staff, Captain Oishi, was the first to speak up. The Combined Fleet Operation Order gives first priority to the destruction of enemy forces. Cooperation with the landing operation is secondary, but the same order specifically calls for our air attack on Midway Island on 5th June. This means that the air attack must be carried out exactly as scheduled, provided that no enemy task forces are located by the time we are ready to launch. If we do not neutralize the Midway-based air forces as planned, our landing operations 2 days later will be strongly opposed and the entire invasion schedule will be upset. With his usual directness, Admiral Nagumo voiced the question in everyone's mind, but where is the enemy fleet? In answer, Oishi continued, "We know nothing of the enemy's whereabouts because we failed to reconnoiter Pearl Harbor. But if his forces are now in Pearl Harbor, we shall have plenty of time to prepare to meet them should they sortie following our strike at Midway. They will have over 1,100 miles to cover. Even if they are already aware of our movements and have sortied to meet us, they cannot be far out from base at this moment, and certainly can't be near us. I think, therefore, that the first thing for us to do is to carry out the scheduled raid on Midway." At this, Chief of Staff Kusaka turned to the intelligence officer and asked if radio intercepts had given any indication of enemy movements. Informed that nothing had been picked up, Kusaka asked if any information had been received from Combined Fleet Flagship Yamato. Receiving another negative response, he addressed a suggestion to Admiral Nagumo. "Since we must maintain the schedule at all cost, would you approve the use of our low-powered interfleet radio for sending the order to change course?" The commander assented to this as the only feasible solution, and the order was sent accordingly by medium-wave transmitter. A reduced power transmission would reach out to the fringe of our force, and, it was hoped, not farther. This method was not entirely safe, but it had worked on occasion in the past, thanks to enemy carelessness. In this case, however, the message was received clearly even by Yamato, which was 600 miles to the rear. Inasmuch as an enemy task force was then only a few hundred miles distant, a fact of which we were totally unaware, it was highly probable that it, too, intercepted this signal. From the first, the planners of the Midway operation calculated that the enemy naval forces would be lured out by the strike on Midway Island, and not before. We had not the slightest idea that the enemy had already sortied, much less that a powerful enemy force was lying in wait, ready to pounce upon us at any moment. Dense fog still hung over the Nagumo force throughout the afternoon, and on into the night. In contrast to the tenseness prevailing on Akagi's bridge, her wardroom hummed with the lusty chatter and laughter of carefree flyers whose only job was to jump into their planes and roar off at a moment's notice. Everything was ready for the scheduled air raid 2 days hence, and no flight missions had been ordered because of the adverse weather. The pilots consequently had nothing to do and passed their time playing cards. Meanwhile, the weather around the Yamamoto force, 600 miles astern, improved somewhat in the afternoon, and refueling which had been suspended on the preceding day, was resumed. The worst thing about the persistent fog was that it cloaked enemy movements in complete secrecy. As previously mentioned, the plan for a flying boat reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor on 31st May, using French frigate shoals as a refueling point, had been thwarted, nor did our submarines provide any information. The sole remaining source of information was radio intelligence. As early as 30 May, such intelligence picked up by Admiral Yamamoto's flagship, Yamato, had pointed to brisk enemy activity in the Hawaii area, especially of patrol planes. This strongly suggested the possibility of a sortie by an enemy force from the Hawaiian base. But Combined Fleet sent no warning whatever to Admiral Nagumo. Admiral Nagumo and his staff were deeply chagrined when they learned after the battle that because of this radio intelligence, Combined Fleet headquarters had suspected an enemy sortie. Why did Combined Fleet not transmit this vital information to the carrier striking force so that any danger of its being taken by surprise might be averted? There were two reasons behind this unfortunate failure. Firstly, Combined Fleet headquarters thoughtlessly believed that Akagi, closer to the enemy than Yamato, would naturally have obtained the same information, and that Admiral Nagumo was formulating his decisions accordingly. Secondly, they feared that radio communication between the two forces would reveal their positions to the enemy. At any rate, Admiral Yamamoto's failure to issue necessary precautionary instructions to the forces under his command was an important cause of the Midway fiasco. He was to blame for being too much preoccupied with the idea of radio silence. It is easy to imagine what angry and bitter emotions must have welled up in Rear Admiral Kusaka when he went on board Yamato after the battle to report on the near annihilation of the Nagumo force, and there learned for the first time of Combined Fleet's negligence. Well might he have said, "My God, how often I told them not to let this happen, if only they had let us know in time." Combined Fleet headquarters, however, was not alone to blame. The Naval General Staff back in Tokyo was also partially responsible, for it again sent a radio to Combined Fleet concerning enemy fleet activity in the Solomon Islands area. The message carried the strong implication that the movement of the Japanese forces toward Midway was not yet suspected by the enemy. The Naval General Staff had originally opposed the Midway operation, but once having given its approval, it was responsible for the whole operation even more than was Combined Fleet headquarters. With the decisive battle only a few days off, it was engaged in gathering all available intelligence regarding enemy activity. What particularly attracted the attention of the intelligence staff was indications that an American carrier task force still was operating in the Solomons area. If this were true, as the Naval General Staff believed, it constituted powerful evidence that the enemy did not yet suspect our intention. For if he did, he would obviously have called all his scarce remaining carriers back from the Southwest Pacific. Even after intercepting a number of urgent calls from American radios in the Hawaii Midway area, the Naval General Staff still stuck fast to its first conclusion. This was perhaps due to the inherent Japanese tendency toward wishful thinking, which permeated our actions throughout the war. The storm of battle was about to break, and for the first time in 6 months, fate did not seem to be smiling upon us. No change, however, was made in the operational plan. All forces plunged onward through the boundless fog like stagecoach horses, driven blindly forward by a cracking whip. 8. Gathering storm, American situation and preparations. If Admiral Yamamoto and his staff were vaguely disturbed by the persistent bad weather and by lack of information concerning the doings of the enemy, they would have been truly dismayed had they known the actual enemy situation. Post-war American accounts make it clear that the United States Pacific Fleet knew of the Japanese plan to invade Midway even before our forces had sortied from home waters. As a result of some amazing achievements by American intelligence, the enemy had succeeded in breaking the principal code then in use by the Japanese Navy. In this way, the enemy was able to learn of our intentions almost as quickly as we had determined them ourselves. In early May, the enemy knew that another major operation was being planned by the Japanese fleet, to be carried out by the end of that month or early in June. The precise objective of this operation was not known at first, but by the middle of May, the enemy had not only learned that the Japanese target was Midway, but also had ascertained with considerable accuracy the makeup of forces to be employed. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief U.S. Pacific Fleet, personally visited the island in early May and took steps toward strengthening the garrison forces and adding to the defense facilities and fortifications. By early June, Midway plane strength had been augmented by the arrival of 16 Marine Corps dive bombers, 7 Wildcat fighters, some 30 Navy patrol flying boats, and 18 B-17s and 4 B-26 from the Army. More than 2,000 garrison troops were deployed ashore, and many anti-aircraft batteries were installed. A number of motor torpedo boats were also brought in to be employed for short-range coastal patrol and night attack missions. In addition, 3 submarine patrol arcs were set up at distances of 100, 150, and 200 miles from Midway, with a total of 20 submarines on stations by 4 June. The United States Pacific Fleet was determined to oppose the invasion of Midway with all the strength that it could muster. On this point, the calculations of combined fleet had been entirely correct. Midway was so important to the safety of Hawaii that the American fleet could not let it be taken without a battle. Advanced knowledge of Japanese intentions was an important advantage, but nevertheless, the prospects confronting the American forces were hardly promising. The Japanese forces to be committed were overwhelmingly superior, and the American carrier situation was critical. Lexington had just been sunk in the Battle of the Coral Sea, and in the same engagement, Yorktown had sustained damage, which made it problematical whether she could get back to Pearl Harbor for repair in time to participate in Midway's defense. Saratoga was still at San Diego, where she had undergone repairs for torpedo damage inflicted by a Japanese submarine on 11th January, some 500 miles southwest of Oahu. This left only Hornet and Enterprise, which, after returning from the raid on the Japanese homeland in April, had been ordered out to the Southwest Pacific to join in the operations in the Coral Sea. Accordingly, Pacific Fleet Headquarters urgently ordered Task Forces 16, centered around Hornet and Enterprise, and 17, including damaged Yorktown, to return at once to Pearl Harbor. Task Force 16 arrived on 26 May, 27th, Japan date, coincident with the sortie of the Nagumo Force from the Inland Sea, and Task Force 17 came in early in the afternoon of the following day. Yorktown went immediately into dry dock, where repair crews swung into action in a furious race against time. After refueling and hasty battle preparations, Task Force 16, now commanded by Rear Admiral Raymond A. Sprue Ants, sortied from Pearl Harbor on 28 May, 29th in Japan, just as the Yamamoto and Kondo forces were leaving Hashirajima and headed for the waters northeast of Midway. In addition to Hornet and Enterprise, the task force contained 5 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 9 destroyers. By afternoon of the next day, repairs to Yorktown had miraculously been completed. She then fueled, took on a quickly organized air complement, and sortied in the morning of 30th May with 2 heavy cruisers and 6 destroyers as Task Force 17, Rear Admiral Frank J. Fletcher in command. These 2 forces were to rendezvous on 3rd June, refuel, and then proceed under Fletcher's overall command to a point northeast of Midway by the morning of the next day. In the light of these facts, it is obvious that the second Operation K, on which Combined Fleet had placed so much reliance, would have been of no avail even if it had been carried out. The flying boats, which were to arrive over Pearl Harbor at 015 on 31st May, would have been too late to catch either Spruance's or Fletcher's forces. Indeed, execution of the reconnaissance as planned might have had worse results than no reconnaissance at all, for the complete absence of carrier strength at Pearl Harbor might have led Admiral Yamamoto to the mistaken conclusion that the enemy forces were still where they had last been reported, in the Southwest Pacific. This delusion would have been furthered by the fact that, on 1st June, Admiral Yamamoto received from the Naval General Staff in Tokyo a dispatch which gave its considered judgment that an enemy carrier force was still operating in the vicinity of the Solomon Islands. And what about the submarine cordons? As far as can be determined from the American records available to the authors, it appears possible, though by no means certain, that the sortie of the American forces toward Midway might have been detected had the Japanese submarines been on station by the scheduled date of 2nd June. By the 4th, however, when they actually did move into position, the enemy carrier groups were to the north of Midway, well beyond the cordon lines, waiting to strike at the flank of the unsuspecting Japanese forces. The trouble, of course, lay in the fact that the entire Japanese invasion plan, including the provisions for the flying boat reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor and the submarine cordons, was based on the assumption that tactical surprise would be achieved and that enemy fleet reaction would not get underway until after the assault on Midway had begun. Combined fleet planners completely failed to provide for the contingency that the enemy might somehow learn of our intentions in advance and thus be able to deploy his forces for an ambush attack. This failure must be ascribed, more than anything else, to the arrogant overconfidence engendered by our early victories. We were accustomed to success, and so sure of our superior strength that no thought was given to the possibility that things might not go exactly as we had planned. The enemy, too, was confident despite the heavy odds in our favor. In a message to the officers and men of Task Forces 16 and 17 on the eve of their sortie from Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz declared that the coming operation will give you a chance to deal a mighty blow to the enemy. Admiral Spruance, on 3rd June, also issued the following exhortation to his command. An attack for the purpose of capturing Midway is expected. The attacking force may be composed of all combat types, including 4 or 5 carriers, transports, and train vessels. If the presence of Task Forces 16 and 17 remains unknown to the enemy, we should be able to make surprise flank attacks on the enemy carriers from a position northeast of Midway. Further operations will be based on the result of these attacks, damage inflicted by Midway forces, and information of enemy movements. The successful conclusion of the operation now commencing will be of great value to our country. Should our carriers become separated during attacks by enemy aircraft, they will endeavor to remain within visual touch. From the first day of June, Midway-based planes patrolled in search of the Japanese invasion forces, covering a semicircle to the west to a radius of 600 miles. Their searches were, of course, hampered by the fog through which the Japanese forces were approaching. But the Americans, whom we believed to be unknowing and unprepared, were in reality apprised of our intentions and standing by in full readiness to attack when the time was right. The curtain was now ready to lift on a battle that would teach us a tragic lesson. Japanese transports discovered. The steady rain which had been falling on the main force finally let up on 3rd June, Japan 4 June, but the sky still looked sullen and threatening. At 0800, according to plan, Admiral Yamamoto ordered Vice Admiral Takasu's guard force to break off from the main body and proceed to cover the Aleutians operations. Takasu was to reach a point 500 miles south of Kiska Island by 6th June, at which time Admiral Yamamoto's main body would be in its planned position 500 miles farther south. The plan provided for the two forces to rejoin in case of a concerted enemy counterattack in either area. Within an hour after the split-up of the main force, Admiral Yamamoto received a sudden message from Admiral Tanaka's flagship, Jintsu, which was in direct escort of the Midway transport convoy. reporting that the convoy had been discovered at No 900 by an enemy search plane over 600 miles west of the target island. Tanaka reported that the enemy flying boat had clung tenaciously to the transports until heavy anti-aircraft fire from Jinsu's companion warships forced it to break off the contact. This development altered the entire aspect of the operation. A part of our forces had now been definitely discovered, and in all probability, its location had been reported. It was clear that action could be expected, and soon. It came that afternoon when a flight of 9 bomb-laden B-17s attacked the transport convoy. Fortunately, no hits were scored, and the transports proceeded on their way. Everyone in the convoy breathed a deep sigh of relief. Early in the morning of the 4th, however, other enemy planes came and made a low-level attack. One released a torpedo which hit the bow of Akabono Maru, a tanker at the rear of the transport column. The resulting explosion was powerful enough to kill 11 men and wound 13, but it must have been a partial dud since material damage to the ship was negligible. She was slowed down only momentarily and did not lose her place in the formation. As reports of these developments were flashed to Yamato in rapid succession, signs of concern began to show on the faces of Yamamoto's staff. Just a short time before they had been beaming with optimism over the prospects of the forthcoming battle. But now things were looking less rosy. They had not expected that the transports would be discovered before Nagumo had launched his attack against Midway. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that the discovery was contrary to their hopes rather than their expectations. The Midway operation plan had provided for the slow transports to be sent out well ahead of the carrier striking force. Thus, they were especially susceptible of premature discovery by the enemy. One way to avoid this danger would have been to advance the departure of the Nagumo force by 1 day, so that American air strength at Midway could be neutralized before the convoy came within range of the island's search planes. Combined Fleet planners had actually considered this modification and proposed it to Admiral Nagumo. But he had counter-proposed that the departure of the transports be delayed 1 day instead. Admiral Yamamoto rejected this suggestion because the landing had been planned for the last favorable day of the lunar phase and could not be postponed. Hence, with some misgivings, the original plan was adhered to. Action to the north, 3rd June 1942. By the time that detection of the Midway transport convoy had foreshadowed the opening of battle to the south, the Japanese diversionary thrust against the Aleutians was already underway. Rear, Admiral Kakuta's 2nd Carrier Striking Force, spearheading the northern thrust, reached its scheduled launching position for the strike on Dutch Harbor in the very early hours of 3rd June. Sunrise was at 02:58, and all preparations to take off were completed 45 minutes earlier to take advantage of the long northern twilight. But the sky, to the disappointment of the crews, did not show first light as expected. On the bridge of flagship Ryujo, Captain Tadao Kato, in a heavy fur coat, was giving last-minute orders to the attack unit commanders. Not only was the enemy situation unknown, but the flyers, who had never operated in the northern Pacific before, did not even know what sort of weather conditions to expect. Rear Admiral Kakuta anxiously patted the shoulder of the staff aviation officer, Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya, to attract his attention amidst the roar of the plane engines warming up on the flight deck, and inquired what he thought about launching the attack. "Please, sir, we will have to wait a little longer," Okumiya replied. He looked at his watch to find that it was 0228, but still the sky had not begun to brighten. Kakuta's senior staff officer, Commander Masanori Odagiri, who had been staring skyward for several minutes, commented that there seemed to be a fog. His observation proved correct and served to explain the continuing darkness. With aircraft carrier Ryujo in the lead, the task force was approaching Dutch Harbor at 22 knots. The mercury stood at 7 degrees below 0 centigrade. Lieutenant Commander Okumiya frowned as he thought of the handicaps under which the attack was being executed. For one thing, the flyers were provided with maps of the Dutch harbor area copied from a chart over 30 years old. The only other guide the Japanese had was a single photograph almost as old as the map. Many shoreline portions of the target island were shown on the map by dotted lines, indicating unsurveyed places. The island was actually unknown to us even in outline. Could the pilots find such a target in bad weather? Failure to locate the targets would mean that there would also be difficulty in getting back to the carriers, and some of the planes might get lost. But this was war. The Japanese forces had come so far for the sake of victory, and there must be no lack of resolution now. Despite the fog, the attack must be launched at the first increase in visibility. Okumiya glanced at the sky with growing impatience. At Zo-238, the shapes of the other ships in the formation began gradually to come into sight. The admiral seemed anxious to order the planes off immediately, but his staff officers still remained silent. By Aero 243, light carrier Junyo, 1,000 meters distant, became clearly visible, and Okumiya shouted, "Sir, we can launch now." The admiral nodded and looked toward the signal officer, Lieutenant Commander Okada, who ordered, "Squadrons, take off for attack." Blinker signals flashed from the flagship. Planes rose methodically from the flight decks into the misty haze. From Ryujo, 11 bombers and 6 fighters took off. From Junyo, 12 dive bombers and 6 fighters, all planes under command of Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga. A cloud ceiling of only 500–700 feet made formation flight impossible, so the planes headed independently for Dutch Harbor, some 180 miles to the northeast. The day had dawned, but still the sun failed to appear. One of the Ryujo bombers crashed into the icy sea while taking off, but prompt action by an escorting destroyer resulted in the miraculous rescue of the entire crew. The attack planes were barely out of sight when enemy scouts began to fly over the Kakuta force. A flying boat maintained close contact through the fog and dropped bombs before finally withdrawing, but there were no hits.